Now, one of the things that I hope you've kind of gleaned from all of this is that based on the memory-based model, the opinions that people express are shaped by the information, or what I've been calling the attitudes we have stored in memory. So let me take a step back and elaborate on this idea of information or attitudes. In many ways, they're the same thing. Information, attitudes, anything that's stored in our brain that is going to affect how we respond to a political question, those all fall under the category of information. So it doesn't have to be factual information. It can be feelings about something positive or negative. It can be a wide range of things. Anything that's going to impact how we feel about a particular political thing that we're being asked about is what we're talking about being stored in the head, either the top of the head or the back of the head, right? What the RAS model tries to do is explain what gets stored and what doesn't, because that winds up being critically important. Because hopefully, this will be clear now that I lay it out, information can only affect our opinions, what we express, if it's stored in memory, right? Because it has to be stored in memory for us to take a random sample of them. But information can only be stored under certain circumstances. And that's what the RAS model seeks to explain. So the R in the RAS model stands for receives and understands. Information can only be stored in a person's brain, in their head, if they both receive and they understand the information. What do I mean by that? I'm going to use the example that I use with my in-person classes to explain this. And this is what I tell them. I say, suppose that you're sitting in here listening to me talk about the RAS model, but in the next class over, there's this incredible lecture being given by this professor that if you were fortunate enough to be in that room, you would be like totally changed as a human being. It's just a brilliant lecture, just amazing lecture that would be so formative in the way you think about things. Is that lecture and what the professor is saying, is that going to influence your opinions? Well, no, it can't possibly, because you're not going to be receiving that information. Now, I suppose it's possible that if another student who's in there was listening to it and told you about it, it might change things. But for the purposes of our discussion, let's just assume that nobody's going to talk to you about it. If that lecture is happening next door and you're not there to hear it, you're not going to receive the information. And if you don't receive the information, there's nothing to store in memory. That's the R receives part. What about the understands part? Well, suppose that lecture is happening in the classroom that you're in. I've invited a guest lecturer in. They're giving this amazing lecture that's just going to change the way you think about the world. But they're giving the lecture in Hungarian. And let's assume, for the sake of discussion, that you don't speak or understand Hungarian. Well, you're going to receive the information. That is, you're going to hear the words, the sounds that they're saying, but you're not going to understand the information because you don't understand Hungarian. By the way, neither do I. So that's the first step. That information can only be stored if somebody both receives the information and they understand the information. And by the way, those are my examples 1 and 2. Right. Example 1 was the lecture is happening in the next classroom and you're not hearing it. Example number 2, the lecture is happening in the classroom that you're in, but it's being delivered in Hungarian, and so you don't understand it. But let's assume we're talking about information that you've received and understood. Does that get stored in memory automatically? Well, no, because here's where the A in the RAS model comes in. Once somebody has received and understood the information, then they either can accept the information or reject the information. If they accept the information, it'll be stored in memory. If they reject the information, it won't. And so let me explain each of those, because it's important to understand this process. Individuals tend to accept information that confirms what they already believe. We refer to this as confirmation bias. We tend to accept information that confirms what we already believe. So for example, if I invite a guest lecturer in who gives you an extensive argument that the earth is actually round, not flat, my guess is that most of you are going to accept the information that they provide because you already know that the earth is round, not flat. Well, so if information is accepted, then it gets stored in memory. And if it gets stored in memory, it can be sampled later on. It can be sampled because it's there to be sampled. The flip side of that is that individuals tend to reject information that challenges their pre-existing beliefs. We call this a disconfirmation bias. Using the same example, if somebody comes into class and they give you an extensive argument for why the earth is flat, my guess is that most of you would reject the information that they provide. That information wouldn't be stored in memory. But let me be clear about what I'm saying. When they tell you that the Titanic didn't sink, it fell off the edge of the earth, you might remember that. Probably you would remember that because that's nonsense. But you wouldn't be storing that information in any way to answer the question, is the earth round or flat? That wouldn't be information that you would store to help answer that question. And so that's what I mean by storing that information. Is that information going to be useful to you in making some kind of a decision? Probably the thing that you remember most about that lecture is how strange it was that I invited a person to tell you why the earth was flat. So we tend to reject information that challenges our pre-existing beliefs. Well, if information is rejected, it doesn't get stored in memory. Again, not that you wouldn't remember the lecture, but that you wouldn't store that information as anything useful in determining the shape of the earth. Well, if it doesn't get stored in memory, then it can't be sampled later on. So what we have stored in our head, whether we accept something or reject something, is critically important to understanding what's in our head and what's not in our head. And then we'll talk about the difference between the front and the back of the head. That's the A part of the RAS model. The R is receives and understands. That in order for information to be accepted, somebody has to receive it and they have to understand it. And then the next step, the A in the RAS model, is accept or reject, and that information that's accepted will be stored in memory. Information that's rejected will not. Information that's accepted can be sampled later on. Information that's not accepted, information that is rejected, won't be stored, and then it won't be available for sampling later on. So that just leaves the S. What's the S in the RAS model? Well, the S in the RAS model is actually the memory-based information processing model. It's that idea that when people are asked public opinion polls, they take a random sample, the S stands for sample, they take a random sample of attitudes, mostly from the top of the head, not so much from the back of the head, and then based on that, they express an opinion. And you're going to hear me repeat that phrase over and over again, the definition of the memory-based model, that people make when people are expressing their opinions, they take a random sample of attitudes, mostly from the top of the head, not so much from the back of the head, and based on the sample, they express an opinion. That's going to be critically important to understand as I go on to the next video. Okay, I hope that was helpful.